Stick RPG appears, on its surface, to be a satire of US culture. Taking after the tone of games like Grand Theft Auto and cartoons like South Park, Stick RPG wants to simultaneously be a fun time waster for people stuck at work or school, while also attempting to say something about our world. The TV constantly updates viewers with news of horrible death tolls. Drinking excessively raises your charm stat. You have the option of selling cocaine as a semi-legitimate career path. Hijacking a car takes more intelligence than becoming a CEO. But much like GTA and South Park, Stick RPG lacks bite in its satire because it doesn't leave us with anything significant to think about afterwards, except the world is stupid. It doesn't point its perspective in any insightful, clever, or even funny directions. And worse yet, Stick RPG's biggest flaw is that, despite wanting to be a satire of US culture narratively, ludically, it is 100% an affirmation of America's worst cultural tendencies, promoting a hyper-capitalist worldview without even a minor amount of skepticism. Stick RPG explicitly states that the goal of the game is to acquire as much net worth as possible. This makes the game explicitly about capitalism, and in such a way that positions the player as the capitalist. Let's look at the ways in which you can make money. First, there's employment at New Lines Incorporated, the only corporation in town. This is the most lucrative way to make money. With the right level of intelligence, you can climb the corporate ladder to the very top, becoming CEO. It takes time and you need to build up a lot of intelligence, most conveniently by going to school. But once there, the CEO makes a lot more money than most other avenues at $100 per hour, or roughly $2,000 per day. Second, there's gambling. You have to have money to gamble, but if you literally play your cards right, gambling can end up making the most amount of money in a short amount of time. Third, there's the stock market. If you buy a computer for your apartment, you can use the computer to buy and sell stocks. This could hypothetically make the player a lot of money, but you have to invest a lot of money in order to see any payoff. I wasn't able to get much out of the stock market in my playthrough, but it seems like how lucrative the stock market is in the game is largely RNG dependent, so your mileage may vary. Fourth, there's interest at the bank. This is the stealthy way to make the most money, because if you pocket a sizable amount of money at a time, the interest will accrue as you do everything else. Alongside the stock market, it's the only other form, and by far the quickest, of passive income. It's so good that I ended up becoming a millionaire without even noticing, just from interest accruing while I was doing other things with my in-game time. Fifth, and finally, there are the illegal methods. Robbing the convenience store and dealing cocaine out of town. Robbing the convenience store doesn't pay out very much money long term, but early on might be a way to make a little more cash, and that's only if you have your charm stat high enough to get away with the robbery in the first place. Dealing cocaine seems like it could make you a lot of money, but you'll find quickly that if you don't get robbed of all of your cash and stash, you end up spending hundreds of dollars on drugs and trips out of town that end up giving you back less money than you put in. So effectively, you're really just losing money. It's possible that the drug dealing option could become more lucrative the more effort and time you put into it, but unless it scores major cash quickly later on, it's likely going to be a far less serious way to acquire max net worth when compared with other options. While the game presents a variety of methods to make money, the most lucrative paths to success are the ones that are most validating to a mainstream capitalist perspective. A good relationship to the bank and climbing the corporate ladder are the best options, and stock trading and gambling can help, but only if you have a lot of money to spare on these ventures already. So now that we know the way to progress, what does progress look like? What do you get from progressing through the game? Well, there are two kinds of progress in Stick RPG, mechanical progressions and wealth progression. As far as mechanical progressions are concerned, there are only really three areas of interest. The first is when you give the kid on the street corner cigarettes and he gives you his skateboard. This skateboard allows you to move faster than walking, which ends up saving the player time, even though it doesn't really have an effect on the player character, other than that he gets to ride a skateboard. The second is when you get intelligence high enough to hotwire the car on the side of the street near the apartments. The intelligence here is absurdly high, around the 300 range, at which point you'll have already developed high enough intelligence to become CEO of the company, which, for all intents and purposes, will put you already into the late game, so to speak, at which point the car isn't all that useful to the player anymore. Third is that if you build up enough strength, you gain new powers in bar fights. Sadly, I found out about this too late, because there isn't really a meaningful progression system to the bar fights themselves. Your opponents don't gradually become stronger and stronger as you win. Instead, you just develop enough strength that there's no chance any of your opponents can beat you. And apart from some money from each person's wallet, there isn't much to be gained from winning bar fights. Still, it is fun to develop literal superpowers just to fight drunks as a side gig for being the actual goddamn CEO of apparently the only corporation in town. Now, aside from mechanical progression, there is also an element of wealth progression. This consists of purchases that require increasing amounts of money, but can often help you accrue more and more money, or else exist just for fun. An example is the ability to buy a satellite dish that allows you to watch the news, the fitness channel, and the dating channel, all of which increase the 3 kinds of stats for the player: intelligence, strength, and charm respectively. The problem with a lot of these purchases is that, apart from the extrinsic motivation of developing stats for generating income, these items offer so little in terms of value to the player. The TV is a very mild exception, because the TV will actually provide the player with new content in the form of text boxes that give the player insight into the world of the game, usually jokes that reveal its satirical view. While these lesser buys may help, the game's overall progress is marked primarily by the purchase of real estate. You can move into bigger apartments, into a mansion, and eventually, a castle. The castle is the implicit win state of the game, as once you have the castle, there isn't anything new you can buy. It's the last increment of progress, and everything after it could be roughly considered the post-game. Getting the castle isn't easy. It takes time. It took me about 2 hours of gameplay to get the castle, which makes Stick RPG's length equivalent to The Witcher 3 by Flash game standards. But what do players actually do with that time? The actual core gameplay loop of Stick RPG consists of traveling between buildings, pressing prompts to generate cash, and then depositing that cash to the bank to accrue interest so that you can build up a net worth big enough to buy the castle at $500,000. As a CEO with a roughly $2,000 max daily income, the player will have to play for about 250 days to make $500,000, and that's if they don't accrue any interest by depositing their money in the bank and don't use any other methods to make money faster. I became a CEO on day 32. I got the castle at day 232. That meant that it took exactly 200 days from becoming CEO to making the $500,000 necessary to effectively beat the game. That means it took me almost an hour and a half of just going from building to building, trying to get more money. My method was probably quicker than some. I would work until I had about $25,000, and then I would gamble and try to double it to make $50,000. Eventually, I would start trying to earn $50,000, then deposit $25,000 in the bank, and gamble the remaining $25,000 in the hopes that I would double that. This was the quickest method of making money because the $25K deposited would accrue interest even if I lost the gamble. But if I won the gamble, then I would deposit the $50K and accrue interest on $75K instead of $25. Stick RPG fully buys into the myth of capitalism. The myth is that anyone can make it big. The consequence of this myth is that if you don't succeed in the game of capitalism, it's a personal failure because you weren't good enough to make it big. This is all a lie, and Stick RPG ironically reveals this inadvertently. If we disregard how absurdly easy it is in the game to become CEO of a major corporation off the street and just start making $100 an hour, which is just never going to happen in the real world, then we see that the only way to get rich is to be rich. To make a lot of income, you have to be CEO. Nobody ever climbs the corporate ladder from janitor to CEO. They typically have to have serious degrees from universities that are very expensive to get into, or they have to have a history with those high up in the company, such as being the founder, or else being family of the founders, or a board member, or being a primary shareholder, which, of course, means having a lot of money to spend on stock trading. Speaking of, the stock market in Stick RPG is basically useless to the player because there's no way to make large sums of money off of it unless you already can spend large sums of money buying shares. The stock market in Stick RPG doesn't work like it does in the real world. The companies that are displayed are not given any information whatsoever upon which to base a decent purchase. If you don't know what a company does, then you don't have a sense of whether or not their stocks will rise in value over time. And in my playthrough, the stocks barely rose at all. Most of the time, they fell. So the stock market in my playthrough became a money sink, which I could afford to lose because I had high income that I could easily waste on it. The stock market is effectively gambling, and gambling only tends to reward those who can afford to sink large sums of money into it. Hence why gambling was highly effective in Stick RPG. There's an irony here. If the game wanted to be satirical in its commentary on the contemporary culture of its era, then gambling shouldn't be a convenient and effective strategy to make a lot of money. Gambling should be rigged against the player. This is what is most famously known about gambling, that it's not particularly fair to people. But when you can spend large sums of money and it's pretty easy to win, the game seemingly on accident suggests that gambling is such a great way to earn big, which is the exact narrative that casinos promote in order to trick people into spending large sums of money. See, the thing about gambling is that in order to give out a lot of money, casinos need to make a lot of money, and they make that money off of the losers. And when you're poor, you're much more likely to lose. The cliche about the lottery is that it's a tax on poor people, and the same principle applies here. Stick RPG exposes the myth by affirming it. Yes, you can make a lot of money at a casino, if you have a lot of money you can afford to lose. The casino really only exists to help the wealthy accrue even more wealth. The game never makes any explicit commentary about whether or not being a hyper-capitalist is a good thing, but it does play into the idea that there's a fantasy of being a capitalist that is appealing. After all, the implicit win state is to own a castle. That's pretty absurd, but it's an absurdity that the player is supposed to be the beneficiary of. This is what it's all for, to live out the fantasy of getting everything you want. And this is where the game gets its most interesting commentary, and it's most likely on accident. Winning Stick RPG sucks. See, games have two forms of motivation: intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic motivations are internal incentives that players have to continue playing a game, something that is rewarding in and of itself without needing some external type of reward. Extrinsic motivations are the external reward that incentivize players to keep playing. The distinction is that intrinsic motivators are things about a game that just feel good to do, while extrinsic motivators are things that the game gives to the player to make them feel like something they otherwise wouldn't want to do is worth doing. These are obviously subjective terms, but there can still be some general consensus about what aspects of games are intrinsic versus extrinsic. An example to illustrate would be beating a boss in a game. The intrinsic motivator could be that you enjoy fighting the boss, so you want to come back to the boss again and again. The extrinsic motivator would be that the boss is necessary to unlock certain content that you want. If a boss is not fun, then extrinsic motivators will promote beating the boss anyway. And if a boss is fun, then extrinsic motivators won't be necessary. While some may disagree, I think most people can agree that intrinsic motivators are just better for the health of a player playing a game. Enjoying playing the game is going to be more important than being rewarded for playing the game. In the past couple decades, games figured out how to maximize playtime through extrinsic motivators. The progression system in Call of Duty, for example, made it so that players would constantly feel motivated to play, because there would be perks, weapon unlocks, skins for your gun, etc. These kept players playing, but I don't think players would continue doing this if killing people in Call of Duty wasn't fun. That said, the scales tipped in the past couple decades to make extrinsic motivators more and more important. They were never completely disregarded, except in more experimental games like LSD the Dream Emulator, but games knew for a time how much value intrinsic motivation had. If you've ever wondered what a game with no intrinsic motivation looks like, Stick RPG would be it. Certainly that's a bit of an exaggeration. There are some elements of the game that are just satisfying, but so little of it is, because so much of the game is abstracted for the sake of the extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivators are the point of the game. It's a numbers game. You don't get a lot of fun mini-games or interesting mechanics that interact with the number goes up design of the game. Instead, it's a mostly raw, distilled, number goes up game, where you just work for pay, and then spend that money on real estate and fancy technology, rinse and repeat, ad nauseum. It is the pure, distilled, abstract form of capitalism manifested as a flash game. And when you play the game, you quickly find that almost everything in the game is an extrinsic motivator. Why do you go to school? So that you can get promoted. Why do you get promoted? So that you can make more money. Why do you make more money? So that you can buy bigger real estate. And when you get to the castle, why do you buy the castle? Well, because it was the last thing on the checklist. Once you have the castle, that's it. You gain nothing that feels good. No new minigame or mechanic, no new perk or power or even an interesting song or anything of the sort. You just now press sleep and check messages in front of a different backdrop than before. It brings no change to the mechanical experience of the game. It is just an arbitrary marker of progress. There is no intrinsic motivation that pushes players to finish the game except the joy of saying, "I beat it." But along the way, all you're doing is clicking prompts to raise stats to click prompts to raise stats. The game is effectively cookie clicker with a less intricate system and slightly less abstract concept. Ironically, Cookie Clicker is more fun because of its absurdity and the fact that extrinsic motivators can be intrinsically motivated when contextualized properly. Stick RPG, sadly, doesn't really accomplish any of this, but Stick RPG does form an interesting commentary about its failure of intrinsic motivation. Capitalism is meaningless. Hear me out. If the point of the game is to become the best capitalist you can be, but you stand to gain nothing intrinsically from it, then what is the point of becoming the best capitalist you can be? What value is there to be gained from making the most money possible if the result is that you feel nothing and you have nothing to show for yourself except a bunch of useless, expensive items? By removing most forms of intrinsic motivation, Stick RPG is a distilled version of capitalism that functions on a level of pure economics. The promise of capitalism is that having money will reward you not just with the personal satisfaction of success, but with things you can do with that success, like throw fancy parties, buy boats and expensive cars, etc. But those things are extrinsic motivators. A fancy car may feel good to drive, but if that was why people bought fancy sports cars, nobody would ever buy a fancy sports car, because there are other cars that also feel good to drive, at which point they would settle for the first car that felt good, rather than chasing the more expensive options. It's never the actual capitalism involved that fulfills people. Capitalism is at its best incidental to personal well-being, and more often than not, is actually detrimental. Even the stick guy clearly had more fun drunkenly fighting people in bars than he did checking a stock portfolio every morning. There are no signs that the character enjoys becoming a millionaire, and the player is primed to not enjoy the experience intrinsically because all of the fulfilling aspects of progress are abstracted. You don't feel the hard work, nor participate in its rewards. Extrinsic motivation is the dominant philosophy of capitalism, and yet it doesn't fulfill people internally. Money can't fill a hole in your heart. Expensive items can't make your life feel meaningful. And capitalism conditions you to not only have that hole in the first place, but to believe the only way you can fill it is to spend, spend, spend. This is especially true in the neoliberal era, where people are conditioned to view their entire lives through the lens of capital and ways to gain more and more money. We work so that we can earn, so that we can spend, so that we can work, so that we can earn, so that we can spend. It's a vicious, self-destructive cycle. Stick RPG is a direct representation of this vicious cycle, and while the promise of capitalism is that the end of the rainbow will give you something of value beyond just capital, Stick RPG doesn't have anything to give you. Mechanically, nothing changes after you win at all. You might as well just jump off a cliff at the end, which I did 30 times, and still couldn't die because ironically, I made myself too healthy. There's a sort of bleak undercurrent to Stick RPG that is made apparent by the fact that there are so few intrinsic motivators in the game. There's only one truly great moment in the game of intrinsic motivation, and ironically, it's one of the very first things you get to do. When the kid on the street corner asks you to buy him cigarettes, if you fulfill his request, he gives you a skateboard. The skateboard is the most important part of the entire game, because the skateboard is fun. I played this game when I was a kid, around 10 years old. My memory of it was most vivid when it came to the little side quest of getting the skateboard. I remember that you have to give the kid cigarettes and he'll give it to you, and I remember pressing shift lets you ride the skateboard around. It was the most fun part of the game for me, being a little stick guy riding around on a little stick board, and yet it had so little to do with the metagame of maximizing profit. It helped me make money faster that I could skateboard instead of walking everywhere, which it feels like was maybe the point behind the skateboard, but riding the skateboard is just about the only part of the game that's actually fun. So if there is a commentary about capitalism being made, albeit unintentionally, that commentary is that there is no intrinsic value to playing the game of capitalism. It offers your soul nothing. It gives you things, but when adopting the capitalist mentality, none of those things mean anything to you besides how to maximize capital, which continues to be a vacant proposition. It's better to just ride around on a skateboard and have fun than to try to make it big in the game of capital. Capitalism is meaningless. Thanks for watching. This video may seem like it came out of nowhere, but I actually had the idea for this video at least a couple years ago now. I've been wanting to make a video comparing different games on the basis of how they systematize elements of capitalism into the actual gameplay and game structure. Stick RPG is one of the most direct representations of capitalism in a game that I've played, so it ended up just being the first one on the list to actually cover. For the record, none of what I said is here to say that Stick RPG is a bad game. I don't really do reviews all that often, but my actual review of Stick RPG is that for a Flash game, it's impressively well put together. It has an interesting conceit, and if you want to waste some time doing some bite-sized Flash games, Stick RPG is one of the better games of that format on a technical level. That said, Stick RPG is a product of the limitations of Flash, and consequently, it's not a very involved experience. This means that a large part of its appeal is dated to its era because of the novelty of a quote-unquote open-world Flash game where you can futz around and do what you want. I commend the developer for making a game that functions well as a proof of concept, but the priorities as far as writing, tone, and the general plot of the game are lacking even for a Flash game. If you want to see the satirical elements of the game done a bit better, check out Doodle God. If you want to see the number goes up element of the game done better, the aforementioned cookie clicker is a good place to start. But Stick RPG is worthwhile just as a time capsule of what Flash devs were able to accomplish on a minuscule budget back in the early 2000s, so I recommend it at least on that front. This video would not be possible without the support of my patrons over on Patreon. Patrons get to see rough cuts of longer video essays early, get their name in the credits, and help support the creation of future videos such as this one. The link for my Patreon is in the description if you want to contribute, and if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe or check out the playlist for my video essays on games that will also be in the description. Thanks again and have a great day.